Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of 2 Corinthians. We're in the midst of chapter 10 of this book, and we saw in yesterday's session that Paul has to return again to defend himself. We made mention of the fact yesterday that it seems that before Paul completed the letter, again this word has reached him, there's some criticism in Corinth of him, people saying he's really not as great as you think he is. And one of the things they said, well, he writes these weighty letters, he's writing his letters, but when he comes personally, he's not that impressive. Now, I want you to notice a few verses in the latter part of chapter 10 where they're criticizing Paul because he's not that impressive of a speaker. Notice verse 9 of chapter 10. I do not want to seem to be frightening you with my letters, for some say, well, his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive and his speaking amounts to nothing. You notice the criticism there? Well, he writes these letters that seem tough and authoritative, but then when he's here, he's a very poor speaker, not articulate, very unimpressive. Such people should realize, says Paul, that what we are in our letters when we're absent, we will be in our actions when we are present. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with someone else or who try to commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. We, however, will not boast beyond proper limits, but will confine our boasting to the sphere of service that God himself has assigned to us. Now, and all that Paul is saying, these folks who are criticizing me, they say, well, listen, we got speakers who are so much better than Paul, who are so much more articulate, who are so much more impressive. So why do you pay attention to Paul, who is so unimpressive when he's here? So Paul says, listen, I'm not getting into that kind of boasting or bragging or comparing myself to others. I am simply going to do what God has called me to do. Notice he says the sphere of service that God has given us, or given me. I'm simply going to stand on what God has done through me. And you remember what God had done through Paul was to establish the Corinthian church. He was the one who founded the church. He was the one who brought them into the kingdom of God by his proclamation of the gospel. So he says, I am your father in the faith, as it were. I was the one who led you to know the Lord. I'm just going to stand on that. And I'm not going to be caught in this trap of comparing myself to these you think are better speakers than I am. So notice Paul's boasting, if he's going to boast, is in what God has asked him to do, the place God has asked him to serve. At the end of the chapter in verse 17, he says, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but it is the one whom the Lord commends. In other words, if you're going to boast, if you're going to brag, you better brag about being in the Lord. And let the Lord commend you. Don't try to commend yourself. These so-called critics of Paul are bragging about themselves as more impressive speakers than Paul is. We're better than him. Paul says, listen, I'm just simply who I am in Jesus. God gave me the sphere of service he gave me. I stand on what the Lord has called me to do. And all I need is the commendation of the Lord. So notice Paul's defense of himself is just to stand in the ministry God has called him to do. The proof of my life is in what I've done, says Paul, in the ministry I've had among you. You know that. And so these critics, I'm not going to get into their game of bragging about myself. I'm just going to be who I am in the Lord. Now, I want to refer to you a few verses we read yesterday because now this comes more into play. Let's go back to verses 3, 4, and 5. Paul says, for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. In other words, I don't have to commend myself. I don't have to brag about myself. I don't have to build myself up. That's the way the world does it. I don't do that. Now, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, the weapons we fight with, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Jesus Christ. In other words, I'm simply going to proclaim the gospel. I'm going to tear down every argument and every pretension that raises itself against the knowledge of God. I'm just going to proclaim the truth as it is in Jesus. And that will tear down every argument. And thus we will take captive every thought for Jesus Christ. See, it's all about Jesus. It's all about proclaiming the message of Jesus. It's all about standing for Jesus. It's all about proclaiming the kingdom of God that comes in Jesus. Paul says, that's what I'm going to do. That's the ministry I've been called to. And if there are some folks who want to criticize me for being unimpressive, I'm not trying to be impressive. I'm simply trying to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ and advance the kingdom of God by the power of his name. That's how I do things. And that's where I take my stand, says Paul. Now tomorrow as we get into chapter 11, he's got some more to say about these critics whom he's going to call super apostles. That's the way they present themselves, as super apostles. But he's going to simply say, I just stand for Jesus. But we'll look at that in tomorrow's session as we get into chapter 11 in our 5-minute Bible study in this book of 2 Corinthians.